There are houses that rest when their masters sleep, and there are houses that remember every voice that ever whispered through them. But this mansion did neither. It grieved. Perched upon the mist-veiled cliffs of Oberland Hill, Chief Damilare Okonkwo's mansion stood like a wounded giant, proud, yet hollow, its heart beating faintly beneath the weight of memories too painful to die. The windows, once radiant with music and celebration, now stared blankly into the gray horizon, reflecting only the emptiness of the man who lived within. Inside that grand house, silence reigned with an authority more powerful than any human master. The chandeliers that had once caught the laughter of parties now hung still, like frozen tiers of glass. The air was thick, unmoving, filled with the scent of decay and forgotten perfume. Every step echoed like a question no one dared answer. Every corner seemed to breathe with invisible sorrow. Chief Damilare moved through these halls like a ghost haunting his own legacy. His movements slow, his gaze heavy, his spirit shackled by the weight of guilt he could not set down. He was a man both feared and pitied, once a symbol of success, now a monument to loss. The tragedy that destroyed him was whispered about in Lagos like a sad legend told at dusk. A night of heavy rain, the roar of a car engine, a scream swallowed by thunder, and then the silence of death. His wife, Ngozi, and their young son had died instantly, leaving behind a man too broken to live and too proud to die. From that night onward, the mansion became a grave that refused burial. Servants came and went, unable to bear the heaviness that clung to the air. The few who stayed spoke in hushed tones, claiming that sometimes, when the wind blew from the east, the walls seemed to sigh, and a woman's laughter could be heard drifting through the upper rooms. Then, one gray morning, as dawn bled weakly across the sky, a woman arrived at the iron gates, a figure small and quiet, carrying a worn leather bag and the scent of rain on her clothes. Her name was Adaeze Nwosu, and her eyes, though calm, held the glimmer of an old sorrow, one that had learned to live with pain rather than fight it. She had come seeking work, not pity, offering to clean what others feared to touch. The gatekeeper, wary yet moved by her gentle composure, led her through the path that wound toward the mansion's heavy doors. When Adaeze stepped into the house, the stillness greeted her like an ancient spirit. She paused, her breath catching as the cold air wrapped around her. There was something alive in that silence, something watching, waiting. She felt it pressing against her chest, testing her resolve. Yet she did not flinch. She whispered a prayer beneath her breath and began her work. Each movement was slow and deliberate, her hands tracing the edges of tables, brushing away dust that seemed older than grief itself. Somewhere above, unseen, Damilare watched her from behind a curtain, his eyes narrowed, his heart conflicted. He had seen many servants, but none had moved through his house like this one, with reverence, as if she were not merely cleaning, but performing a ritual of resurrection. As the day passed, sunlight began to creep into forgotten corners. The air shifted. The mansion exhaled. Adaeze hummed softly as she worked, her song low and rhythmic, the kind that mothers sing when rocking their children to sleep. The sound unsettled Damilare. It reminded him of something precious that time had stolen, a warmth he no longer believed he deserved. Yet against his will, he listened. By the time the last ray of light withdrew from the windows, he found himself standing at the threshold of his own dining room, watching her wipe away the years from his life, with nothing more than patience and silence. Without quite knowing why, he spoke. His voice was deep, brittle, unused. "You can stay," he said simply. Adaeze looked up, her eyes soft but unwavering, and nodded once before returning to her work. Night fell heavy upon the mansion. The lamps flickered, shadows stretched long across the marble floors, and the house seemed to hum with a strange, cautious life. Adaeze worked late, her reflection gliding across the polished floor, the rhythm of her movements echoing through the great hallway, like a heartbeat returning to the body of something long dead. Upstairs, Dammelaer stood at the window, watching the rain slide down the glass in slow, shimmering trails, wondering for the first time in years whether fate had sent him a stranger or a sign. As midnight deepened and the storm outside grew wild, Adayz wrung her mop one last time, her mind half lost in the whispering sound of rain. Then, as she turned toward the grand staircase, a chill brushed her neck, soft but unmistakable. The air shifted, the lamps flickered low, and from the emptiness just behind her ear came a woman's voice, delicate as breath and soaked in longing. "You came back." Dawn crept over Oberland Hill like a shy confession, its first light trembling against the mansion's shattered windows. The rain had passed, but the air still smelled of thunder, of secrets that refused to stay buried. Somewhere within those echoing corridors, Adayz moved slowly, her bare feet pressing against the cold marble as if she were learning the house's heartbeat. She could still feel that whisper from the night before, soft, female, and far too close to her ear to be a dream. The mansion waited for her like a patient ghost. Shadows curled along the staircase, and the polished floors reflected the gray light of a hesitant morning. Adayz stood in the center of the grand hallway, her cleaning cloth folded in her hands, her chest rising and falling with an uneasy calm. She whispered to the air, testing the silence. "I am not afraid of you," she said, her voice barely more than breath. "You just need to remember how to be alive." The words slipped, away into the vastness, yet the air shifted, as if the house was listening. She began her work with reverence rather than haste, the way a nurse might tend to a sleeping child. Dust yielded beneath her fingers, mirrors awoke beneath her cloth, and the once lifeless chandeliers began to catch the light again. Each movement felt like an offering. Her mind wandered to her own lost home, to the little wooden cross that marked her husband's grave, to the ocean that had swallowed him years ago. She worked because work was prayer, and prayer was all she had left. From the balcony above, Chief Dammelaer watched her in silence. His eyes, ringed with exhaustion, followed every motion of her hands. There was something unnervingly familiar about the rhythm of her cleaning, the same patience, the same grace that his late wife Ngozi once carried when arranging flowers or soothing their child. It struck him like a memory refusing burial. For a moment, he imagined he could hear Ngozi humming the same tune Adayz now murmured under her breath. His throat tightened. He turned away, yet the melody followed him, soft but relentless, weaving itself through the corridors. By midday, the mansion began to change. Sunlight slipped across the floor in long golden stripes, illuminating corners that had not seen day for years. The heavy curtains sighed open, stirred by a breeze that smelled faintly of hibiscus. Somewhere in the kitchen, water boiled for tea. Somewhere else, a forgotten clock ticked once and then again, hesitant but alive. Adayz smiled faintly when she heard it, whispering, "You're waking up, aren't you?" The sound of her voice filled the room like warmth returning to a body, too long frozen. Dammelaer found himself standing at the foot of the staircase, drawn without knowing why. He studied her closely, the slope of her shoulders, the calm persistence in her face, and felt an ache that was both painful and strangely comforting. He wanted to speak, to ask who she was, how she could move through grief as if she understood its secret language. But his pride, that old armor forged from sorrow, held his tongue. Instead, he cleared his throat. "You may stop for today," he said quietly. Adayz looked up, startled but unafraid. "I'll finish this room first," she answered, her tone firm but gentle, like someone refusing pity. Something in her composure unsettled him. It was not defiance. It was strength. Evening approached slowly, painting the halls in gold and ash. Adayz worked until the light dimmed, her thoughts lost in rhythm, her soul steady in the hush. The house now hummed faintly, as if remembering music it once knew. Outside, the sky darkened into velvet. Inside, her cloth traced circles on the long dining table that stretched like a memory of vanished feasts. She pressed harder, feeling resistance beneath the grime, a small lump beneath the layer of dust. Her hand stilled. She brushed again, the grain of wood revealing a faint shimmer. Something golden winked back at her from the dimness. Adaz bent closer, her breath shallow, the faint scent of metal meeting her nose. Embedded between cracks in the polished surface lay a small locket, its chain curled like a sleeping serpent. She lifted it gently, the gold warm against her palm despite the cool air. When she turned it over, the faint engraving caught the light, and her eyes widened in disbelief. Etched in a delicate script was a single name, the same name she carried within her own chest, Adaz. Some secrets hide in silence, others wait to be discovered in gold. The moment Adaz lifted the locket, the air inside the dining hall thickened, as though the house itself held its breath. Light from the old chandelier fell across her trembling fingers, and for an instant the reflection of her face shimmered within the curve of the metal. It was as if she were staring at her own soul, trapped inside that small golden prison. The chain slid through her hand, like silk. The locket's hinge creaked softly, releasing a breath of air that smelled faintly of perfume and time. Inside lay a photograph, its edges yellowed, its image delicate, yet haunting. It was a family portrait, Chief Damilare Okonkwo standing tall beside a woman whose face mirrored Adaezi's own. The resemblance was terrifying. The same eyes, the same quiet smile, the same serene tilt of the head that made her seem both fragile and powerful. Adaezi's heart lurched violently, as if something old and buried had been awakened within her blood. She had never seen this woman before, and yet she felt the undeniable sting of recognition, as though a forgotten memory was clawing its way back to life. Her breath came shallow, her palms damp. She looked around, suddenly aware that the mansion had gone utterly silent. Even the ticking clock she'd heard earlier had stopped, as if time itself paused to witness what she had found. A soft creak echoed from the hallway, followed by slow, deliberate footsteps. The air grew heavier. Then Damilare appeared at the doorway, his presence cold and commanding, his expression unreadable in the dim light. For a heartbeat, he did not speak. His eyes fell on the locket glimmering in Adaezi's trembling hand, and all color drained from his face. He took a single step forward, his voice low but shaking. "Where did you get that?" Adaz swallowed, her lips barely moving. "It was here, Chief," she whispered, her voice laced with confusion and awe. "It called to me." The silence between them deepened. Damilar's gaze locked on the photograph, and memories flooded him without mercy. He had hidden that locket years ago, unable to destroy it, but too tormented to see it again. It had belonged to his wife, Ngozi, who had worn it every day until the night of the accident. No one was supposed to find it, least of all a stranger with her face. His anger flared, a defense against fear. "You have no right to touch that," he snapped, his voice echoing off the walls. Adaezi stepped back, startled, her heart pounding in her chest. "Forgive me," she whispered. "I didn't mean to intrude." Her voice trembled, but there was a strange calm behind her fear, a quiet dignity that unnerved him even more. Damilare moved closer, his shadow falling over her like a storm. "Who sent you here?" he demanded. "Tell me the truth. Who told you about her?" "No one," Adaez replied, her eyes wide yet unflinching. "I only came to work. I found it under the dust." He stared at her, searching for deceit, but all he found was honesty, raw, unguarded, and painful to look at. Her face was a reflection of the love he had lost, and that truth tore through him with unbearable cruelty. His rage faltered, replaced by confusion, then by something far more dangerous, recognition. Her voice, her gestures, the calm in her eyes, they all mirrored Ngozi. Every heartbeat brought the past closer, until he could no longer tell where memory ended and the present began. He turned away, pressing his palm against his forehead as if to steady his thoughts. "This is madness," he muttered. You cannot be her." Yet when he turned back, Adais was still there, standing quietly beneath the trembling light, her hands clutching the locket as though it were the last piece of truth in the world. A tremor ran through the chandelier above them. Dust drifted from the ceiling. The mansion seemed to react to their shared confusion, its walls groaning softly as if awakened by the collision of past and present. Outside, thunder rumbled across the distant hills, echoing like a heart that refused to die. Adais set the locket on the table with reverent care. "I'm sorry, Chief," she said gently, her voice breaking through the tension. "I didn't mean to upset you. It was there, waiting. I only touched it because it felt familiar, as though I'd seen it before, in a dream I can't remember." Her eyes glistened with something close to tears, though she tried to hide it. Damilare could not respond. His throat tightened around the weight of disbelief. He had spent years punishing himself with the image of his wife's face, and now that same face stood before him in living form. Could fate be mocking him, or was this woman a messenger sent by the past? His mind refused to accept it, but his heart, aching and treacherous, whispered otherwise. When she tried to leave the room, he reached out impulsively, his hand gripping her wrist before he realized what he'd done. "Stay," he said almost pleadingly. The word carried the desperation of a man drowning and clinging to the memory of air. Adais turned slowly, meeting his gaze. For a long, breathless moment, they simply stared at each other, the grieving man and the woman who bore the face of his salvation and his curse. That night, Damilare did not sleep. The storm outside clawed at the windows, thunder shaking the old glass in fits of rage. He sat by the fire, the locket in his hand, its gold glinting faintly in the flicker of flame. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw Ngozi's face, and then, seamlessly, Adaisi's. Their voices blended into one, echoing through his thoughts like music from another life. Exhaustion finally overtook him, and when sleep claimed him, it carried him into a dream that felt too vivid to be imagined. In the dream, he stood in the old garden beneath the moon, the flowers swaying as if alive. From the mist, Ngozi appeared, her face serene, her eyes shining with love and sorrow. She reached out to him, her voice soft as the wind. "She has my eyes," she whispered, her hand brushing his cheek. "Don't send her away." And before he could speak, she vanished, leaving behind only the faint scent of roses and the echo of a promise he could no longer ignore. Some griefs are too heavy to bury. They learn to breathe beside the living. For years, Chief Damilare Okonkwo had slept beside silence, fed on shadows, and spoken only to the dead. His mansion was his confessional, his prison, and his tomb, and within it, his sins whispered back to him with every echo that touched the walls. Night after night, he sat before the fire, the golden locket gleaming faintly in his hand, haunted not by what he had lost, but by what he could no longer forget. Sleep refused to claim him fully. When he closed his eyes, he saw faces, Ngozi's laughter frozen in time, their son's small hand reaching from the smoke of memory, and each vision ended the same way, with the screech of metal and the silence that followed. In the waking hours, those ghosts did not leave him. They lingered in corners, drifted through mirrors, and waited at the edge of his dreams. His world was not divided between life and death, but between what he could touch and what he could not let go. He had built empires that spanned nations. His wealth could bend the world, but it could not mend the fracture inside him. The night Adais arrived, that fracture deepened, not with pain, but with life. Her presence had disturbed the careful stillness of his grief, the delicate quiet he had wrapped around himself like armor. He told himself she was an intruder, a servant, a reminder of what the past had stolen. Yet every time her voice drifted through the house, humming soft and low, he felt something stir inside him, something both unbearable and necessary. When Adayz sang as she worked, her melodies wove through the halls like incense, rising through the dust of years. He would pause on the staircase and listen, unwilling yet unable to move away. The tone of her voice was not identical to Ngozi's, yet it carried the same ache, the same serenity that had once calmed him after storms of business and betrayal. He would close his eyes, and for a single heartbeat, it was as if time had folded in on itself, bringing the lost back to him through sound alone. But grief does not surrender easily. He tried to avoid her, to retreat into his study where the windows were sealed and the air never moved. But even there, her voice reached him, filtering through walls that had once been deaf to life. Sometimes he would speak into the silence, addressing no one, and yet speaking to everyone he had buried. "You see what you've done," he murmured one evening, his eyes on Ngozi's portrait. "You sent her to torment me, didn't you?" His own voice startled him. It sounded older, smaller, almost afraid. Outside, the night grew heavy with the scent of rain. He rose, pacing the length of the corridor, the echoes of his footsteps chasing one another through the dark. Everywhere he turned, Adayz's touch had changed the house. The polished floors, the opened drapes, the faint aroma of soap and lemon replacing the odor of despair. It infuriated him that he could no longer find peace in misery. He pressed his palm against the cool wall, his breath uneven. "If this is your doing, Ngozi," he whispered, "then speak to me. Tell me what you want." The wind moaned through the hallway in answer, faint but distinct, and as he turned toward the sound, a sharp crack broke the silence. The portrait above the fireplace trembled once, then crashed to the floor, its glass shattering like ice. Beneath the wreckage, a hidden envelope lay wedged against the wall, sealed in wax and coated in dust. Damilar knelt, his hands shaking as he brushed away the debris. Written in delicate, fading ink were the words, "To the one who will come." The dead speak, but only to those brave enough to listen. The envelope lay in Damilar's trembling hands, its paper yellowed, its corners frayed by time and dust. His breath came shallow as the scent of old perfume rose faintly from the seal, a fragrance he knew as well as his own heartbeat. It was Ngozi's. The wax cracked beneath his thumb like a brittle bone, and as the flap opened, a whisper seemed to escape, soft and sorrowful, as if the letter itself exhaled the memory of the woman who had written it. His fingers hesitated before unfolding the delicate paper. The handwriting flowed in graceful, familiar curves. Ngozi's hand, alive on the page, steady and full of love. The date at the top froze him where he stood, written exactly 1 day before the crash that had taken her away. The ink, though faded, carried a warmth that felt impossible, as though the message had waited patiently all these years for the moment when he would finally be ready to read it. "My dearest Damilar," it began, the words blooming like ghosts in the candlelight. "If you ever find a woman who carries my peace, let her stay. Through her, I will love you again." He read the sentence twice, then again, his heart pounding louder with each repetition. The sound of his own breathing filled the silence. The letter went on, softer now, its tone both farewell and blessing. "Do not curse your survival," it said. "It means your heart was chosen to remember. Love is never buried. It only changes form." He pressed the letter to his chest, his eyes closing, tears rising unbidden. For years he had lived convinced that fate had stolen everything from him. Yet here was her voice, breaking through death's silence, turning his pain into purpose. Adayz's arrival was no coincidence. It was a prophecy. Every resemblance, every echo of Ngozi's laughter, every strange comfort he felt in her presence. It was all written here, waiting for him to understand. He moved to the window, the letter clutched against his heart, and stared out into the fog-drenched night. Below, the garden lay silver in the moonlight, the same garden where Ngozi used to walk barefoot in the mornings, her laughter chasing away the dew. He could almost see her now, moving through the mist, smiling at him, her voice whispering through the trees. Through her, "I will love you again." Damilare sank into the old armchair by the fire, his strength dissolving into quiet tears. The mansion no longer felt haunted, it felt inhabited. Every shadow seemed gentler, every creak of the wood less cruel. He wanted to fight the meaning of the words, but they had already taken root inside him. Adaize was no longer just a stranger. She was the continuation of a story he thought death had ended. He tried to resist the pull that connected them, tried to convince himself that his wife's message was symbolic, not real. But fate is patient. It doesn't ask for permission. Each time he heard Adaize's footsteps echo through the hall, his heart leapt with a mix of dread and longing. Every time she spoke, he heard Ngozi answering in harmony. His world was shifting, quietly, inevitably, like the tide turning beneath the surface of grief. As he whispered the last line of the letter aloud, his voice trembling, his eyes blurred with tears, he felt the temperature in the room change. The candle beside him flickered violently, and from the doorway came the faint sound of footsteps. He turned, breath caught in his throat. Adaize stood there, her eyes glistening, her face pale with emotion, as if she already knew what the letter had said. The paper slipped from his hands as their eyes met, and for a heartbeat, it was as if the dead had drawn them both into the same breath of destiny. When the heart begins to heal, even walls start to exhale. The mansion that had once slept under layers of sorrow began to stir, its silence replaced by something softer, something like hope. Under Adaize's quiet care, rooms that had long been sealed opened their eyes to the morning again, and corridors that had only known echoes began to hum with the gentle rhythm of life. The heavy air, once burdened with grief, now carried the faint scent of cooking spice, fresh linen, and whispered laughter. Adaize worked with devotion that went beyond duty. She dusted not only the shelves, but the memories resting upon them, washing every surface as though she were cleansing pain from the very bones of the house. The curtains no longer clung to darkness, but swayed freely with the breeze that wandered through open windows. Rays of light poured across the marble floor, like liquid gold, settling on portraits that had spent years hiding from the sun. Each morning, the house woke with her, as if taking its cue from the steady rhythm of her movements and the quiet music of her presence. Damilare watched this transformation in silence. At first, he kept his distance, observing from behind half-closed doors as Adaize hummed while working, her voice threading through the emptiness like the echo of something sacred. But soon, the distance between them began to shrink, not by intention, but by nature. He found himself joining her at breakfast, at first in silence, then gradually in conversation. Their words were slow, careful, like two travelers crossing an unfamiliar bridge. They spoke of small things: weather, the garden, the stubbornness of the old clock that refused to die. But slowly, those conversations deepened. She spoke of her lost husband, of the sea that had swallowed him and the dreams that drowned with him. Damilare, in turn, spoke of the accident, his voice breaking only once when he admitted, "I used to hear their laughter in my sleep." Adaize's reply was simple, her tone as calm as prayer. "That means they never truly left." From that day forward, something unspoken bound them. Damilare began to rise earlier, meeting her in the courtyard where the hibiscus bloomed again. She showed him how to tend to the flowers, how to let the soil breathe. Their hands often brushed, and each touch carried a warmth neither dared name. At dinner, he began to wait for her before eating, and when she laughed, a soft, uncertain sound, it filled the mansion with music he had forgotten he loved. Slowly, she became the rhythm of his mornings, and the silence of his nights, the calm in the storm he had lived within for too long. The servants noticed the change. They whispered among themselves that the chief's ghostly mansion was alive again, that the woman with quiet eyes had broken the curse. Even the mirrors seemed clearer, the floors warmer underfoot, as though the house had begun to breathe along with its inhabitants. Damilar could not explain it, but he no longer wished to. For the first time in years, he slept without nightmares, and in his dreams, he saw light instead of loss. But peace is a fragile guest. One evening, as Adais set the table for dinner, the air shifted, softly at first, then sharply, like a breath caught between laughter and fear. From the far end of the corridor, faint and unmistakable, came the sound of a child's giggle, sweet, fleeting, echoing through the hallways of the mansion. Adais froze, her heart hammering. The laughter came again, closer this time, bright and alive, though no child had lived there for years. The plate in her hand trembled, and for the first time, the living and the dead seemed to share the same breath once more. The past doesn't die. It waits for the right voice to awaken it. The mansion was quiet again that night, but it was not the silence of peace. It was the silence that comes before confession. The echo of a child's laughter still lingered in Damilar's ears, faint yet piercing, like a note struck on an invisible piano. He followed the sound through dim corridors, the light from his lantern trembling against the walls, his heart thudding in the rhythm of memory. The air grew colder with each step, as though the house was leading him somewhere it had long wanted him to go. He stopped at the door at the far end of the west hallway, the nursery. The key still hung in the lock, rusted with time and neglect. His hand hesitated before turning it, the metal scraping softly, releasing a smell of dust and forgotten dreams. The door creaked open, and there it was. The room untouched since the night of the accident, preserved like an offering to sorrow. Toys lay scattered across the floor, small shoes still tucked neatly by the bed, a tiny sweater folded carefully on the chair beside the window. The curtains swayed gently as though moved by a child's invisible hand. The air was heavy, thick with the ghosts of laughter that had once filled this space. Damilar stepped inside, and the sound of his own breathing grew loud, strange, almost foreign. His lantern light danced across the walls, illuminating the faded drawings his son had once made. Scribbles of stars, boats, and faces smiling in crooked circles. His eyes stung with tears he could not control. The memories struck with the force of a tide he could not hold back. His son's laughter, Ngozi's song, the way she used to hum while tucking the child into bed. He staggered slightly, his hand brushing against the crib, and in that instant he heard the faint squeak of the mobile above it turning slowly, though no wind stirred the air. Behind him came a soft gasp. He turned sharply. Adais stood at the doorway, her hand clutching the frame as if the weight of memory might pull her down. Her eyes were wide, shimmering with both wonder and fear. She had followed him without meaning to, drawn by the same inexplicable call that had led him here. "You shouldn't be here," Damilar whispered, his voice thick, almost breaking. "Neither should you," she replied, her tone low but steady. "And yet here we are, still breathing." Her words hung between them, fragile but powerful, the kind of truth that doesn't demand to be spoken again. Damilar looked at her then, not as a servant, not even as a stranger, but as someone standing on the same cliff between loss and life. For the first time since his family's death, he felt the strange peace of being seen, of sharing the unbearable with someone who understood it. Grief, meeting grace, found a language of its own in the silence between them. Adais stepped further into the room, her gaze drifting over the tiny bed, the toys, the faint outlines of joy left behind. She knelt slowly beside a small table, her fingers brushing over a book of childish sketches. The cover was cracked, the pages fragile, each one filled with drawings made in crayon and love. He drew every night, Damilar said softly, his voice trembling with memory. He said it helped him dream. Adais smiled faintly, though her eyes shimmered with tears. Then his dreams were beautiful, she whispered. For a long moment, neither spoke. The house seemed to hold its breath, listening to them, weighing the tenderness of their grief against the years of silence. Somewhere beyond the window, the night wind sighed through the trees like a lullaby from another time. As Adais turned to leave, her gaze fell to the floor near the foot of the crib. Something pale and folded lay half hidden beneath a wooden block. She bent and picked it up carefully. It was a child's drawing, the lines faint but clear. A small figure stood beside a tall man, their hands clasped, both smiling. But what made Adais's breath falter was the woman drawn beside them. A woman with her own face, her same gentle eyes and calm smile, sketched years before she had ever stepped foot in this house. The paper trembled in her hands as a chill swept through the nursery, and for a moment, time itself seemed to hold her captive in that impossible truth. When light returns, darkness comes knocking. News travels fastest when it tastes like resurrection, and soon the people of Oberland Hill whisper of a miracle. Chief Damilare Okonkwo, the man whose mansion had long been a tomb, was smiling again. Rumors swirled like wind through the market streets. Some said he had found God, others said a spirit woman had come to cleanse his home. Either way, the mansion no longer wept. It breathed. And from the shadows of that rumor, one man took notice, the kind of man who thrived in the cracks of another's happiness. His name was Kunle Adeyemi, Damilar's former business partner, a man who once called himself brother, but whose loyalty had always been tied to profit. He had stood beside Damilar in his days of power, and vanished when tragedy struck, leaving only silence in his wake. Now, years later, he returned, not with comfort, but with curiosity sharpened by greed. The news of Damilar's renewed warmth stirred in him a restless envy. He remembered the fortune they had built together, the companies, the contracts, the empire of influence they once ruled. But more than that, he remembered the old mansion's worth, the land, the art, the hidden investments, and wondered who this mysterious woman was who could unlock the chief's heart after so many years of mourning. Kunle arrived unannounced one afternoon, his expensive car gleaming like arrogance under the sun. The guards hesitated, but recognized the name, and within minutes he stood in the grand hall, smiling that same smile that never reached his eyes. "My brother," he said warmly when Damilar appeared, "I came to see if you still breathe." His words dripped with false affection, but Damilar, softened by Adais's quiet influence, welcomed him nonetheless. They spoke over tea, exchanging pleasantries that carried the weight of old betrayals. Kunle's gaze wandered constantly, searching for her, the woman he had heard so much about. And when Adais entered with a tray of fruit, dressed in her simple wrapper, serene as morning, Kunle's interest deepened. Later that night, he began his work, the kind that slithers rather than walks. With a few phone calls and bribes whispered into the city's underbelly, he began digging into Adais's past. It did not take long for him to find what he believed would become his weapon, a record from years ago, a case of theft from a previous employer. The accusation had been dismissed for lack of evidence, but the stain remained, a shadow easy to twist into truth. Kunle smiled as he read, already tasting the satisfaction of power. "So, she's not an angel after all," he murmured to himself, folding the paper carefully. Every savior has a sin to expose. When he returned the next day, Damilar noticed the glint of cunning behind his words. "My brother," Kunle said, "I'm happy to see joy in your eyes again. But be careful. Not every light is divine. Some are traps in disguise." Damilar frowned, sensing poison beneath the honey. "Speak plainly," he replied. Kunle leaned forward, lowering his voice. "She's after your wealth. These women, these widows, know how to use sorrow to their advantage. I've seen it before. You're not healed, Damelair. You're being hunted. The word struck harder than he expected. Doubt, subtle and cruel, began its slow crawl into Damelar's heart. He wanted to dismiss it, but Kunle's tone carried the weight of false reason. His mind began to drift toward the past again, toward betrayal, toward loss. He remembered the locket, the resemblance, the coincidence of fate. What if it wasn't fate at all? What if he had been deceived again? Adai's kindness suddenly felt dangerous, too perfect, too timely. Fear disguised as logic whispered that perhaps Kunle was right. That night, Damelar walked the corridors alone, the sound of Adai's humming echoing faintly through the house. He paused outside her room, hand hovering near the door, his heart warring with his mind. He wanted to trust her, to believe that her gentleness was real, that Ngozi's words were truth and not fantasy. But the past had taught him one lesson above all, that love and pain often wear the same face. He turned away, the coldness of suspicion already forming between them, like frost. As midnight deepened, Kunle sat in Damelar's study, the dim lamp casting long shadows across the polished desk. From his briefcase, he drew a file bound in red twine, his smile thin and satisfied. When Damelar entered, Kunle rose and placed it before him without a word. The folder slid open under the chief's trembling hands, and there, stamped in black ink across the first page, was Adai's name, and beneath it, a single word that turned the room to ice. Criminal. Trust is fragile. One lie can shatter a lifetime of healing. The mansion that had begun to breathe again suddenly held its breath, waiting for truth or betrayal to decide its fate. Damelar sat at his desk, the red folder lying before him like a wound he did not want to open. Kunle's words echoed in his mind. She's after your wealth. You're being hunted. He wanted to reject them, to protect the peace that Adai had built in his heart. But curiosity is the twin brother of doubt, and doubt has a cruel appetite. He opened the file slowly, the paper crisp despite its age, the ink heavy with accusation. The words leapt at him. Theft, suspicion, dismissed for lack of evidence. Yet for a man who had known betrayal, the dismissal mattered little. All he saw was the echo of deceit, the shadow of another heartbreak waiting in disguise. He leaned back, the letter from Ngozi heavy in his pocket, his mind torn between prophecy and fear. Could fate be so cruel as to trick him again with the same face, the same gentleness, the same illusion of salvation? When Adais entered that evening, unaware of the poison now blooming in the air, she carried her usual calm. Her hands were folded, her eyes steady, her voice soft as she greeted him. "Good evening, Chief," she said, unaware that this would be their last. Damelar looked up, his gaze sharp, his tone colder than he intended. "Tell me," he said slowly, sliding the folder toward her. "What else have you kept from me?" She looked down at the file, her breath catching for a brief, painful moment. Her fingers brushed the paper, then withdrew. "Where did you get this?" she asked quietly. "It doesn't matter," Damelar replied, his voice trembling between anger and sorrow. "What matters is whether it's true." Adai stood still, her eyes glistening, her face unreadable. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she answered, "Truth doesn't shout." The words hung in the air like smoke. She did not plead or argue. She did not rush to defend herself. She simply looked at him, the man she had begun to heal, and saw in his eyes the return of the same walls she had worked so hard to bring down. "I was accused once," she said softly after a moment. "Not because I stole, but because I was poor enough to be blamed. And when you are poor, silence becomes the only dignity left to you." Her words broke something in him, yet pride held his tongue. He turned away, hiding the turmoil in his chest. "I can't," he whispered, more to himself than to her. "Not again." That was all she needed to hear. Adai stepped back, her expression calm but hollow, her heart cracking quietly inside her chest. She looked around the room one last time, the shelves she had dusted, the windows she had opened, the chair where she had once left laughter. Her eyes lingered on Damilar's bowed head, and then she turned toward the door. On the floor by the threshold, she placed the broom she had carried since her first day, a symbol of her labor, her faith, and her unspoken prayer. Outside, rain began to fall, soft at first, then heavier, each drop drumming like a heartbeat against the mansion's stone walls. As Adayz walked into the storm, the lights within the house flickered once, twice, then faded completely into darkness. The silence returned, deeper than before, and the mansion that had learned to breathe seemed to mourn, its warmth extinguished with her departure. Inside, Damilar sat alone, staring into the void, unaware that in pushing her away, he had once again chosen to live with ghosts instead of the living. Sometimes, losing peace hurts more than losing love. The mansion that had once begun to breathe again fell back into stillness, its windows darkened, its hallways heavy with the echo of absence. The air was thick with the scent of rain and loss, and each room seemed to whisper the same name, Adayz. Without her, the house was not merely empty, it was hollow, like a body from which the soul had quietly departed. The walls that once shimmered with life now stared blankly, as if ashamed to have ever hoped. Damilar moved through the corridors like a ghost chasing its own shadow. Each footstep stirred memories he could no longer bear to face. Her laughter still lingered faintly in the air, her touch on the polished banister, her song in the rhythm of the wind that brushed against the curtains she had opened to the sun. He had thought grief was something that stayed buried, but it was alive again, stronger, sharper, crueler than before, because now it carried the shape of the woman who had healed him, only to leave him broken once more. At night, he sat by the fireplace, the letter from Ngozi lying open on his lap. He read her words again and again, each one a blade cutting deeper into his understanding. If you ever find a woman who carries my peace, let her stay. Through her, I will love you again. He had found her, and he had let her go. The realization struck like thunder, and the sound of his own sobs filled the vast room. For the first time in years, Damilar wept not for what he had lost to death, but for what he had destroyed with doubt. Days blurred into nights. Food went untouched, conversations forgotten. Kunle's visits ceased when he realized there was no victory to celebrate, only ruin. The staff moved quietly, their eyes lowered, unwilling to disturb the chief's growing despair. The mansion grew colder, its lights dimmer, until even the air seemed reluctant to remain. Damilar wandered aimlessly, sometimes calling Adayez's name under his breath as if she might answer from another room. But only the house replied, sighing in the wind, weeping in the rain that trickled through the cracked window panes. It was then he made his decision, not out of pride, but out of longing. The letter in his pocket burned like a pulse, urging him forward. He could no longer live among ghosts when the living woman who carried his peace still walked somewhere under the same sky. So, one morning, as mist rolled down from the hills, he stepped through the gates of the mansion for the first time in months. The world beyond its iron bars felt foreign and vast, yet he walked, following the invisible thread that connected his guilt to her grace. He searched through villages, markets, and roadsides, asking quietly, humbly, whether anyone had seen a woman with calloused hands and eyes like dusk. Days stretched into a week, his body weary, his hope fragile but unbroken. In every face he passed, he looked for forgiveness. Then, one evening, as the rain began to fall again, he heard the sound of a broom against stone and the soft hum of a familiar voice. Through the half-open doors of a small church, he saw her, kneeling on the floor, scrubbing with the same calm patience that had once brought his house to life. Adayz looked up, her face illuminated by the dim glow of candlelight, her eyes wide with surprise and sorrow. Between them, the rain poured through the open doorway like tears from heaven, and in that single breathless moment, Dammelaer understood that peace had not left him. It had simply waited to be found. In the right storm, forgiveness can wash away even the deepest scars. The rain outside the church poured like a baptism from the heavens, drumming against the tin roof with the rhythm of an old hymn. Lightning flared across the stained glass windows, casting flashes of color over the stone floor, where Adaize Nwosu knelt in silent labor. Then the doors swung open with a mournful creak, and there in the doorway stood Chief Damilare Okonkwo, drenched from head to toe, the storm clinging to him like guilt refusing to let go. For a heartbeat, neither moved. The rain hissed behind him, the candles trembled before her. Their eyes met, his hollow with remorse, hers glistening with disbelief. The moment felt suspended between time and eternity, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Dammelaer took one hesitant step forward, his shoes leaving a trail of muddy repentance on the sacred floor. Adaize rose slowly, her hand still gripping the rag she had been using, her body trembling between fear and forgiveness. He fell to his knees before her, the sound echoing through the quiet sanctuary like a confession too heavy to speak. "You cleaned my house," he said, his voice breaking, "but I destroyed the one who cleaned my soul." Rainwater streamed down his face, mingling with tears until they were one and the same. "I doubted you when I should have believed, and in doing so I have lost twice, first to death, and now to my own blindness." Adaize looked down, at him, the rag slipping from her hand. Her heart twisted, remembering the man she had met months ago, a man chained by grief, now unshackled by regret. She bent beside him, her trembling fingers lifting his face until he met her gaze. In her eyes there was no anger, only an ache so pure it softened the thunder outside. "Then let's start again," she whispered. "This time with truth, not walls." The words carried the quiet power of prayer. He took her hands as if they were relics, fragile but divine. The church smelled of rain and candle wax, of endings and beginnings. Adaize helped him to his feet, her own body shaking under the weight of the moment. They stood together in the center aisle as lightning flashed once more, painting their silhouettes on the walls like ghosts made flesh. Then the storm broke fully, the wind howling through the open doors, rain sweeping in to soak them both. Neither moved. Instead, Dammelaer drew her into his arms, holding her as though forgiveness itself might dissolve if he let go. Outside, the thunder rolled like a drum of remembrance. Inside, time melted into the sound of their sobs. "I thought I was cursed," Dammelaer murmured against her shoulder. "But you were my deliverance all along." Adaize shook her head gently. "No, Chief. We were both cursed by memory, but it is memory that has brought us here." They pulled apart just enough to look at each other, their faces wet, their hearts raw, and smiled through the ache of everything they had endured. When the first peal of thunder subsided, they began to speak of the days between them. He confessed to the file, to Kunla's poison, to his weakness. She listened without interruption, her silence no longer a shield, but a mercy. When he finished, she placed her palm over his heart. "You are not the man you were," she said softly. "Pain changes us, but it does not have to end us." He covered her hand with his own and nodded, unable to speak. Through the open doors, the rain poured heavier, flooding the steps, and yet neither sought shelter. They stood within it, as if it were cleansing them of every unspoken word, every wound, every ghost. Hours seemed to pass in minutes. The storm's roar faded to a gentle percussion, the rhythm of calm after chaos. Dammelaer turned toward the altar, his gaze catching on the wooden cross bathed in candlelight. "I used to pray for death," he admitted. "Now I pray only to deserve life again." Adaize stepped beside him, whispering, "Then live, for those who left, and for those still here." Her voice trembled, not from fear, but from the awe of finally being seen. Together they knelt before the altar, the puddles of rainwater shimmering around them like liquid glass. For a long while there were no words, only the soft sound of two hearts learning to breathe together again. The candles flickered, bending toward them as though even flame sought warmth from their reconciliation. The faint scent of jasmine drifted through the air, the same scent that had clung to Ngozi's locket, and Damilare knew, without doubt, that his late wife was there, watching, blessing, forgiving. When they rose, the church seemed transformed. The shadows had thinned, the light softer, the air almost humming. Damilare brushed a strand of hair from Adaize's forehead, his touch reverent. "Will you come home?" he asked quietly. She hesitated, glancing toward the rain-streaked doorway. "Only if you promise that home will never again be built on sorrow." He smiled faintly, his first true smile in years. "Then let us build it with peace." She nodded, and their hands clasped, not in servitude, but in promise. They stepped together toward the door, the world beyond it washed clean, the rain turning the dirt road into silver. As they crossed the threshold, a sudden gust of wind swept through the church, extinguishing every candle at once. The sound startled them both, and they turned back instinctively. The silence that followed was deep, holy, and alive. Then, without warning, the great bell above the church tower began to toll, slow, resonant, echoing through the valley. Neither of them had touched it. The ropes hung still, the ladder unmoved. Yet the bell rang again and again, its sound rolling like thunder wrapped in grace. Damilare and Adaize stood hand in hand beneath the rain, listening as the heavens themselves announced their forgiveness, unaware that with each toll, destiny was turning its final page. Some homes are not built with bricks. They are rebuilt with hearts that forgive. When Damilare and Adaize returned to the mansion on Oberland Hill, the gates that had once groaned beneath sorrow opened without protest, as though the house itself recognized the rhythm of their footsteps. The air was soft with the scent of rain and rebirth, the ground glistening beneath the morning sun. As they crossed the threshold, the stillness that had haunted every room began to dissolve, replaced by the faint hum of something pure, life returning to a place that had forgotten how to live. Together, they walked through the corridors that had once been prisons of memory. Damilare moved with reverence, his fingers brushing along the walls as though greeting old companions. Adaize followed quietly beside him, her eyes tracing the light that spilled freely across the floor. The mansion no longer seemed vast and empty. It felt alive, welcoming. The portraits on the walls, once cloaked in shadow, seemed to glow anew, their painted eyes no longer sad, but watching over the living with quiet pride. In the grand hall, where dust had ruled for years, sunlight poured down from the windows like mercy, and for the first time in a decade, laughter echoed, deep, unrestrained, and alive. What had once been a tomb of sorrow became a sanctuary of hope. Adaize insisted that the mansion's rooms should never again remain locked in silence. She opened the east wing to the widows of the village, women who had known loss but not comfort. The west wing she filled with the laughter of orphans, children who had lost everything, yet still carried joy in their hearts. Together, she and Damilare transformed grief into grace, turning the house that once buried a family into a home that rebuilt many. The sound of footsteps and laughter replaced the long sighs of despair. The mansion no longer wept. It sang. The townsfolk began to speak of the miracle on the hill. They said that the chief had been delivered from the hands of death by a woman who carried light in her silence. Visitors who passed through the gates claimed they could feel the peace that radiated from its walls, as though the house itself prayed for every soul that entered. Damilare's laughter returned, strong and full, while Adaize's presence became the pulse of the mansion, her every step a quiet hymn of gratitude. They no longer lived as master and servant, but as two souls reborn from ruin, building something larger than love, a legacy of compassion. At dusk, Damelaire often sat on the balcony where he had once stood alone, watching the horizon bleed into gold and rose. Adais would join him, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes reflecting the peace she had fought to restore. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes they didn't need to. The silence between them was no longer heavy. It was sacred. On those evenings, Damelaire would whisper to the wind, thanking his late wife for guiding him not back to the past, but forward to the kind of love that heals instead of haunts. One quiet morning, as the first light crept across the marble floor, a messenger arrived at the gate, carrying a small white envelope. The seal was old, but unbroken, pressed with a symbol Damelaire knew too well. His hands trembled as he opened it, his heart pounding as though the years had folded back upon themselves. Inside lay a single sheet of paper, and upon it, written in the graceful hand of Ngozi Okonkwo, were 6 words that ended the circle and began eternity anew. Now you understand what love is. The wind swept through the open doors as he read, and for the first time the mansion exhaled, alive, eternal, and free. If this story touched your heart, don't let it end here. Every week we bring you more tales that breathe with the soul of Africa. Stories of love, loss, and redemption that remind us what it means to be human. Subscribe, stay with us till the very last word, and let every story wash over you like the rhythm of life itself. Because somewhere in these stories, you might just find a piece of your own.